Hi, I'm Bruce Nathan. I'm a partner with the law firm of Lowenstein Sandler, and joining me is Andrew Bellman, my partner. We are very pleased to introduce Legal Landscape, which is a periodic video series sponsored by Credit Research Foundation and Lowenstein Sandler. This series is intended to spotlight hot issues, emerging trends, interesting issues for credit and order-to-cash for the order-to-cash community.
Thanks, Bruce. I'm excited to kick off our new series with today's topic, the bankruptcy roller coaster. Up, down, where are we going? Are Chapter 11 filings gone for good, or is this just the calm before the storm? In March 2020, at the onset of the COVID pandemic when it hit the United States, we saw a massive shutdown spanning the entire US economy, all sorts of industries, all across the country. We saw everything shut down. As a result, we saw a massive surge in Chapter 11 filings. We saw companies that had been on the edge get kicked over the cliff when their revenues suddenly fell to zero. In 2020, throughout the year, Chapter 11 filings were the highest level we've seen since 2008 and 2009 in the Great Recession. But then, suddenly, in October of 2020, bankruptcy filings just fell off a cliff. They hit a 40-year low across the board when that trend continued in 2021. Where did those cases go? With everything shut down, we would have expected Chapter 11 filings to continue surging all the way through 2020 and well into early 2021. But they didn't. So Bruce, what happened?
When the pandemic occurred in March 2020, everything shut down. The economy shut down. It was the worst contraction in our economy since the 1929 crash. This happened all over the country. It happened all at once. And it was all intensive in terms of industries. Retail, people weren't going to the stores. Travel, nobody was traveling on planes, trains, or subways. Hospitality and leisure, nobody was going to the movies, nobody was going to hotels. Restaurants, nobody was going out to restaurants. Energy, we actually had negative prices for oil. The market had crashed in the energy industry. Automobiles and other manufacturing had pretty much stopped. So what happened? What was the result? Well, we had a spike in unemployment, a large decline in GDP, and a massive shock to the economy. But unlike the Great Depression in 1929, the government responded with extensive stimulus. There were 5 stimulus bills that were passed by Congress that pumped $5.7 trillion of cash into the economy. That was trillions to households, cash payments, unemployment expansion. Andrew, what else do we see the federal government do?
The federal government's stimulus efforts weren't just fiscal. They weren't just payments to households. They weren't just extension of unemployment benefits. We also saw massive, unprecedented monetary accommodation by the Fed. We saw asset purchases rise to levels that we'd never seen before. And we saw the Fed reduce the Fed funds rate target, and we saw the effective funds rate itself fall to 0 in March of 2020, and it's stayed there ever since. The sum total of all of this fiscal and monetary stimulus is that GDP and unemployment recovered very quickly from the shock that they saw in early 2020. But in the course of making that happen, we also saw $6.3 trillion new dollars get created in just 22 months. To put that in a little bit different context, out of every $100 circulating in the US economy right now, 29 of them did not exist less than 2 years ago. Where'd that money go? A lot of the money went to households, and households have actually saved a lot of it. Why? Because they couldn't spend it. And in many cases where folks were under a mortgage moratorium or under a rent moratorium, they didn't have to spend it. So households saved a lot of it. Institutions are hoarding a lot of that cash, but a lot of it also went to the debt markets. And we saw leveraged loans and we saw high yield bonds being issued at record levels and at record low yields. In 2021, high yield bonds generally hit record low yields of under 4%, which is incredible because if you look back just a few years, that would have been a super prime home mortgage rate. Junk bonds rated CCC and below hit 6.5% yields. Just unbelievably cheap money. So Bruce, with all of that cash getting lent to stressed and distressed companies at incredibly cheap prices, what result? What's going to happen?
What you had is you had banks with lots of cash to lend, lots of cash in the economy, and a lot of loans were made to companies which in normal times loans would have been denied to, companies that were in financial distress and likely to file bankruptcy. But after the 2020 surge, with all the cash that was out in the economy and cash that was being lent to companies, and that could have included refinancing, that kept a lot of marginal companies that would have otherwise filed bankruptcy out of bankruptcy. The problem is that cheap borrowing doesn't solve all problems. If the company has operational issues and they're not fixed, that's not solved by cash being thrown at them through loans. If the company, for example, a retailer had unprofitable stores and was still operating them and not closing them, a lot of that cheap cash didn't solve that problem. If a company was substantially leveraged on its balance sheet and needed deleveraging, more loans would just increase the leverage, and that put an additional onus on a lot of financially distressed companies. So what you had here was all this cash, all this lending, the refinancing available, was just covering up problems. It delayed the inevitable. If anything, easy credit made for more problems for a financially distressed company because they had more debt that they had to deal with. Before the pandemic in 2019, debt was about $10.8 trillion. It blew up in 2021 to $11.4 trillion. So, Andrew, what else is compounding problems for financially distressed companies?
Well, Bruce, what's going to compound that problem, and what has been compounding that problem, is the I word, inflation. Starting in the middle of 2021, we started to see inflation creep into the U.S. economy. At first, the Fed started telling people, oh, it's transitory. It's a temporary phenomenon. It's just from the economy restarting. It's going to go away in a quarter or two. And what ultimately turned out to happen for the full year of 2021 is that inflation ended up being much more pervasive and much more persistent than the Fed expected and that media outlets expected when it started showing up in the middle of the year. We see raw material prices that are hitting all-time highs. They've retreated a little bit from those levels, but they're still high. And for the full year of 2021, we finally saw inflation hit a 40-year high. That would be a scary number even in normal economic times. And looking forward, when we look at the bond markets and we look at what the bond markets are pricing in for the expectation of inflation, the TIP spread, the Treasury Inflation Protected Securities spread, is pricing in average inflation of 3% over the next 5 years and 2.5% on average over the next 10 years. Not permanent, not astronomical, but durable and above normal. In late 2021, we finally saw the Fed come out and announce that they were going to take actions to try to curb inflation once it became evident that inflation was going to be durable. We saw the Fed announce that they were going to begin tapering asset purchases. The Fed signaled that rate increases were coming. And the current midpoint estimate among the Fed Open Markets Committee is a 0.9% Fed funds rate in 2022 and a 1.6% Fed funds rate in 2023. Those numbers are not back up to 2019 levels yet, but a far cry from the 0% that we've seen for the last 2 years. So combined with the end of all the other stimulus programs, what that really means is that the era of free money is coming to an end. So Bruce, where's that going to leave us with respect to bankruptcy cases?
The answer to that question is in what the Fed is going to do in the next year or so in terms of raising interest rates. We expect interest rates to increase. The question is, how much of an increase? The Fed is expected to taper off their purchases and start dumping the portfolio they have. All of this is in response to inflation. And the question is inflation going to continue at the roaring rate it was at the end of 2021 when it grew for the year at 7%? Or is there going to be some tapering off? The only outcome that comes from Fed contraction is an increase in bankruptcies. The question is when? Well, the bottom line is if inflation continues and it doesn't abate, then you're going to see more interest rate increases. And interest rate increases are just going to increase the number of Chapter 11s that are going to be filed. The biggest concern here is, will the contraction by the Fed, as well as the loss of stimulus funds, result in a recession? And what is a recession going to do? A recession is going to also increase bankruptcy filings. On the other hand, if things work out, and there is an optimism, at least in some quarters, if the supply chain issues ease, if the inflation rate starts to come down a little bit, the Fed might actually take it easy on interest rate increases, and then bankruptcies may not increase. There's still lots of cash for refinancing, and the bankruptcy can maybe kicked down and increase maybe later this year, maybe next year. The bottom line is we expect an increase in Chapter 11s sometime in 2022, likely in the second half. And things are going to get very interesting as maturities approach, and a lot of financially distressed companies are going to hit a debt wall sometime over the next few years. Bottom line, keep your eyes out on inflation, keep your eye out on the Fed, and stay tuned. We hope to have more video presentations on bankruptcy prospects as the year goes on. Thank you very much for joining us today.